Thank you. There's several other presentations in there, but just wanted to say thank you guys for taking the time to joining me. This is I broke in now what Linux Manual Privilege Escalation 101. Let's who I am. Bachelor's degree in computer systems engineering. I'm a senior security engineer with a little bit over 7 years of IT experience. I'm a red team enthusiast. I'm by no means a hacker. Have a CCNA, SSCP, HAPT, CISSP, just kind of like a little alphabet soup in here. More complex alphabets. Experience on incident detection and response. Honestly, I've always found incident detection really fascinating because with the information that you have, like you're given little pieces of information and put a picture together, which is definitely really fascinating. And you kind of get to do a little bit of detective work, which is awesome. Favorite color is pink. And when I was a kid, I was terrified of Mr. Clean. Creepy and grumpy. But yeah, I guess you grow up and you learn. If you're a blue teamer, why are you teaching me pen testing stuff? A very common question that I've always gotten. I had coworkers reaching out to me like, why are you putting so much effort into this? And, like even one of my old bosses, like, you do realize we don't pen test in here, right? You're never going to be a pen tester, at least not in here. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. But I always thought that if you really want to protect an environment, you have to think as an attacker, right? So you want to know how an attacker would act in order to, in order for you to take the right measures and, the right actions for you to protect your environment. Another thing is that is very common. The industry tries to glamorize contesting, and it's true. Red teamers are fascinating. I get to be a hacker, and I use the hashtag hacking, and I'll take selfies and post them on Twitter, and just with my hoodie, and that's fun. But they really don't talk about the challenges that a blue teamer would face. A red teamer starts there, they go through all the steps. First, and it's over. I'll go home and watch the Kardashians or do whatever I do. While a blue teamer basically is working in a way, if you see it like this, they're basically working 24/7. So an attacker or a really, really bad person wouldn't really be bad just from 9 to 5. So I guess it's just something to keep in consideration. They're playing pretend is the blue teamers that are the unsung heroes of the whole entire industry. That's just the way I see it. What is exactly privilege escalation? Well, privilege escalation vulnerabilities are security issues that allow users to gain more permissions and a higher level of access to systems or applications that their administrators intended. These types of flaws are valuable for attackers because they're needed for full exploit chains, but can be overlooked by defenders or developers because of their lower severity scores. So what does this even mean? It's just like a whole bunch of text. But if you think about it for a second, whenever you compromise an application, whether it's, like via port 80 or port, just through SMB or through FTP, you manage to gain a shell. Now that I think about it, I've never really seen FTP in production. I'm pretty sure some people still use it, but it's a very old protocol. And you don't really gain access to system or to the administrator user or to the root user. If In an ideal world, a system administrator works under privilege. What does this mean? You give permissions for them to perform their daily tasks. And when I mean just talking, for example, Bethany from accounting, or Pedro from the front desk, or Alice from accounts payable, or like Bob from project management, or users. But this should also apply for basically service accounts like Apache or www. Those type of accounts should really be given the very bare minimum access for them to perform what they're supposed to do. Sibling ring. 2009, a group of affluent Hollywood teenagers broke into celebrities' homes to steal luxury items. They took as much as they could, and they went unnoticed for several months. What does this have to do with privilege escalation? Although this happened the time I heard about it, I was kind of I think I was back in 2014. And if I'm not mistaken, they even made a movie about it. But when they interviewed these people, I was so surprised about the answers that they gave. They were like, yeah. So we looked at the most obvious solutions, or, like for the most obvious things to do for us to get access. We created persistence in a way where we could have taken a copy of the key if we wanted to. And yeah, we got so used to and so comfortable with it that we started taking much as, like we could and we wanted. So three things came to mind. They were persistent. They looked for the most obvious or easy solution. They managed to remain sneaky. So those would be, like really good things escalation, or even for compromising a machine for the first time. Cubs is like pen testing, but backwards. Awesome. The ugly truth. And when I say the ugly truth, that we face, again, this industry is really going to try to glamorize pen testing, which is, like, it's pretty cool. But one thing to take in consideration is, for example, it is unlikely that you'll find one size fits all type of exploit. Whenever you're trying to work with an exploit, you're going to give you a shell. You have to make some changes. You have to, like, if you're lucky, you might only just need to change like the port number and the IP, but there's a lot more to that. There might be like a directory that you need to change. I don't know, attempt to brute force with just a different username, or maybe you're missing a library, which those are a nightmare if you're really not familiar with any type of programming. So, pivoting could privilege escalation. So this kind of reminds me of who are the people in your neighborhood. Just because you're not able to gather something useful from your current, like, round. So you really want to take a good look at what's in your network and what is the purpose of those computers that are in there. Like, is it some kind of web server? Is it a print server? Is this just, like Linda from IT? Just anything. So this is kind of like a rinse and repeat process. You're not able to find anything the first time. Okay, enumerate again, enumerate better. Look at those other machines in the network. If you found credentials, that's awesome. Try to test those credentials tedious, and you just want to, like, privilege escalation. actual pen test. This is one of is really not architecture for the actual pen test. Like for you to feel comfortable in practice, there's really not going to be something defined for privilege escalation itself. Creating sandboxes for customization, research, and testing. Well, you know what they expect, and you don't want to get in trouble. So if there is an exploit, or if there is like like you have a defined privilege escalation methodology, you're not just going to run to the client machines and try everything just like crazy. If it's something you're not familiar with, it really doesn't matter if you're practicing like in Hack the Box, or like what's the other one? What's a try harder one? Oh, OSCP, that one. And anyway, it really doesn't matter, because you can just reset the machine and then you're good to go. But in the real world, you can really mess up a client's environment and then get in trouble. Awesome. Now the my slide is really not exactly working. Okay, there it is. Yay. Okay, explain like I'm five. We're really not going to reinvent the wheel in here. We're just gonna talk about a little bit of the basics when it comes to, like the attack kill chain. For example, reconnaissance, identify it, try to gather operating systems, architectures, versions, anything that we could potentially, and very useful. A lot of people say don't underestimate the power of reconnaissance. Saying, hey, I hacked into this box and I didn't enumerate. So, I mean, this is just common knowledge. Everybody knows that if you want to start getting an initial shell, it's very important to, like enumerate well. Weaponization. This means basically pairing an exploit with a particular vulnerability. That, like we have an open port doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to exploit it. Perhaps it's patched, or, like we're not able to find anything functional. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing that is important is when we're enumerating well, bigger target, bigger chances of you to get, like bigger chances for you to be able to compromise something. So we have our exploit. How are we going to place it where it's supposed to go, right? So either if it's something that we need to inject code, or we need to place a reverse shell, are there any additional ports open that we have access to? That we really want to keep in mind is, for example, and I used to say, okay, here's an exploit, but why doesn't this give me a shell? Where is my reverse shell? Why am I not able to connect to the, like the end host? All exploits work the same. Some of them might do different things that you could use to your advantage. For example, this particular case, when it a hash that I could use for a web application. So I had to correct the hash, use, like the standard, like default admin name, and boom, I was in. And it's, like self-explanatory. How do we activate the payload or the exploit that we just delivered? How do we trigger it? What do we have to do? Whether we have to, like just make a user click on something, or make a user open an attachment. So there's some from our end, or an action for it to work. Do we want to add or install additional tools? A hands-on keyboard, right? We're basically able to do anything we want, and at this point, we kind of have full control. Actions and objective. So, what were we trying to gather out of all of this? We're fun because we're bored. Are we really bad people? Is this just an engagement, like from a client? So whatever your final objective was, basically we just get to it. Backwards, it's about a group of security operations analysts that work for a TV station and use logs to save an innocent man from going to jail. This means, and I saw this like years ago, but sliced bread. The word toxicity, but industry when it comes to the use of Metasploit. You just go and eat, like food from Whataburger or McDonald's or whatever. And most commonly used, you're not a real hack. Well, I've heard that's paint by numbers. Like everything is pre-made. There's really no point to it. Try harder. That's my favorite. So yeah, it's like something very common. And honestly, I don't see why. I'm not really here to bash on Rapid7. I think they're a great tool, and I find it extremely useful. But it is unlikely that in the real world, you'll find a client telling you, hey, you better not be using Metasploit, or, like, don't use this. Tells you, don't use Metasploit, or don't use so-and-so tool, then you should be good to go. With them, it's basically the challenges that you could potentially deal with is you get what you pay for. I assume like the paid version has more visibility. Another thing is visibility. So I want you all to think of something. If y'all ever use times, have you actually looked at your exploits, like open code? Because I for sure didn't when I got started. So I don't remember it very clearly, but when I was just getting that I use it, I think it was for a net tappy vulnerability. It was for a very old Windows XP machine, and it didn't really even give me like a shell itself. It gave me an BNC session, and it was slow as crazy, and I could very barely move the mouse, but I felt like I was a hacker. Anyway, just customization requires expertise. There's two things to this. You really have to know what you're doing in order to get the results that you expect. And this applies pretty much for everything, not just for pen testing. So if you really want to be able to write your own code, you have to have a good understanding of the vulnerability. Just get familiar with the vulnerability itself. Just learn how it works. What are the limitations for which operating systems or for which type of services, like would apply to. So here is pretty much like a little rundown of our Metasploit modules. We have auxiliary, payloads, exploits, encoders, and notes. For auxiliary, I'm going to have to say this is definitely one of my favorite modules because even though it doesn't really give you a shell or an exploit, information that you could gather and what you could potentially use during other steps, and even nmap scans or fuzzing, I've honestly never tried this for Linux and Metasploit, but I know that for Windows there is an auxiliary module where you have the option to impersonate token. So you find credentials, you can actually impersonate that user. I know that manually you can do it with a hot potato, but for Metasploit, the impersonate token option is right there. And it's a lot easier and it really saves you a lot of time. So basically that one is, like a self-explanatory. So what happens with those, you get to select which payload do you want. And for that, okay, what is a payload? Payload is exploitation or what you want with your victim computer. Do you want to get a reverse shell from it? Do you want to connect to it directly via, like TCP bind, or do you just want to be funny and pop in the calculator? Well, that is a potential payload. Pretty much all the potential codes that we would want to use. The format of the presentation that we want to give to our equal secure. I honestly believe that there isn't such thing as this is unhackable or this is 100% secure. It doesn't exist. You might as well be looking for a unicorn. Just gonna add that extra layer of security and you might make it trickier for them to find you. Then there's no for no operators. And what is a no operator? It doesn't do anything. And why would we want an operator that doesn't do anything? Well, for example, for memory alignment, we're trying to use buffer overflows if we want a pointer to point or to be assigned to a certain part of the registry. There are certain programming languages that do not allow nulls. Instead, to invalidate or void an instruction. That's when we use a null operator. MSF Venom. MSF Venom is a tool that allows users to generate payloads and encode them. The MSF Venom are one single tool, standardized, and increase the speed. So what I mean with one single tool is the fact that before 2015, there was a combination of MSF payload and MSF encode. And now you can just it's all bundled up together. So that's awesome. And this is what an MSF Venom tray. So as I was mentioning earlier, reverse TCP, use the Apple ones in the with interpreter. But it's definitely something that I want to do at some point. Done. These two are the ones that I most commonly use, Linux generic and Python. Would do like an exe. So you can create, always have to go to Metasploit and kind of look for them. Why escalate privileges? And that's a really good question. Knowing your distribution type, and that's gather general info. So I used to think that Linux distributions were pretty much like Matthew McConaughey movies. You've seen one, you've seen them all. But that's really not true. Really not available for other distributions. And others is currently running. You want to be able to visualize what you're fighting against. right? So you want to see which applications and services are running, so you might be able to exploit them. Weak file permissions. So we might be able to exploit that. For example, the typical case of Linda from Accounts Payable has permission because she's always been harassing, like the IT department, and everybody's afraid of her. Times, like I was mentioning before, it's not really the fact that you have to be extremely technical. You just have to keep your eyes open. A lot of the times it's the fact that as they really do their due diligence and incorrect permissions are assigned, which is basically for Linux scheduled tasks. Configuration files. So with configuration files, the fun part is we might not be able to get a shell out of them, but we might be able to see a version, a default user, and a lot of the times, lazy admins just reuse their passwords. Possible to replace legitimate binaries with our code as a means of executing them at higher permissions level. If a user has permissions to write into the folder where the binary is located, then the file can be replaced with a custom payload. Long story short, if I can write to it, I can write whatever I want, including a reverse shell or a way for it to connect back to me under root privileges. And so a lot of you guys are really familiar with all of these commands. We're really not going to go super crazy on them because I don't want to put you all to sleep. So we're looking at our versions of the kernel, the computer that we connected to, ifconfig. We want to see our current IP, ARP-E, to look at our local addresses, which ports are open, which, like services are in there, which port numbers. We can see ID, which user are we, password, for example, that would be like all the current accounts or all the current usernames that are in that computer. Sudo-L bits. Honestly, this is really important when it comes to privilege escalation. So sudo it stands for super user do. I'm so sorry, guys. Okay, so here's what happens with me. I speak very broken English, but in my defense, I've been in the US for like 5 years. So anyway. So this is recorded, but if y'all ever have any kind of issue understanding what I'm trying to say, just ping me and I can totally repeat that. So back to sudo. Yeah, super user do. So there are times not have root privileges doesn't necessarily mean that there are not certain commands on the root permissions. So I like how I'm having a window open. Something and it doesn't work. So screen, but in here, sudo-L. What does this mean? All the applications and all the potential commands that I could run under root permissions. I'm going to try to do sudo vim. I like how I cannot type for my life. And then boom, I'm root. So basically what I did in here was abuse the vim option that I have. I can see that for Nano, I can see that for FTP, I can see that for, I'm gonna go back to my old account. A different command. So let's just go ahead and try example. Oh, okay. Yeah, there is still a way that I can abuse this if I do an exclamation point. Boom. I'm root. So another thing that keep in mind is that you want to keep in mind is under the sudo options, Google that. So it's like, okay, how do I abuse Nano and map option? So this is really helpful. Files, world writable directories, world writable files, and checking for unmounted file systems. Why on earth would I want to know, or how is this anything useful? Okay, because if you want to be able to copy your post-exploitation tools or any tools that would potentially help you, you want to find a location where they work. If I can write to it, I can write whatever I want. Just basically see which applications are installed as root. What files am I able to see under the HTML folder? This would be, especially useful if we're talking about a web server. And in here, which applications are running under SUID? The lazy way. Obviously, there's always going to be an easier way to do it. So script that will show you relevant information about the security of the local Linux system of verbosity, so you can control how much information you see. Do it, transfer this file. Either you can do it TCP server or a folder victim box. Again, the way of how to transfer it, that's really subjective because you can do it that way, or if you have, for example, FTP port open, or you notice that you have access to their web application or their web portal, and you already have like a standard user credential. Okay, I'm going to pull the file, and then I'm just going to go to pull it from there. So you have to work with basically with the options that you're given. And then you pull your file from your attacker box into your victim box. And this is a way for you to notice that everything was transferred correctly. If you get a 200 here, it means it went okay. Current user groups, yes. Other uses of this shell, yes. Other binaries. This is one of my favorite type of ways of privilege escalation. As for groups, this is really fun because I remember back, I was trying to notice that I didn't really have enough permissions myself, so I can grant permissions. And we were goofing off, and he was like, grant them yourself. And I was like, okay, maybe I will. So I could actually give myself permissions. And in a normal environment, you should not be able to do that. SSH files owned by user. So this is basically going to give you like the standard set of questions or the standard set of points that you want to be looking at. if you want to escalate account that I created for testing. So that's me. Never rely just on, like those typical tools. You want to be able to do it the, like old-fashioned, boring, difficult way. To copy anything, or you're not going to be able to find a, like directory that you can write to, and you want to be able to read the output of this type of tools. Like, it really doesn't make any sense if it's just spitting information randomly and you don't really know what it means. Find this. Make sure that you have a good understanding of how the vulnerability is exploited, which is what I was mentioning before. Validate that the exploit works and it works as intended. So never, ever test in production. Just, it's recommended to have like a practice computer or like a virtual machine that you can test it on. Your target. If your lock is just going to be source IP directories and ports and very basics, but I can tell you right now, it's a lot more to that. Notes or indications of sections that need to be modified. So I think when I asked Philip Wiley necessarily Metasploit, like, well, there are ways for you to find exploits and run them correctly. And I remember asking him, and I was just like, all frustrated. Okay, so how to run them? Well, there is documentation, and most of the time, the exploit in there tells you how to run it. So, oh well. Just read your exploit. Don't just try to blindly run it. Just read what it says. The database is an ultimate archive of exploits and vulnerable software, a great resource for penetration testers and vulnerability researchers. So you to find them. Metasploit out. So, okay, I mean, just personal choice, I guess. If it's for privilege escalation, the platform, master options in here. Particular option of SearchBlood in Kali. So you can just type SearchBlood and the name of the application that you want to find an exploit for. There is, in the industry, like, ooh, I use Kali, I'm such a hacker. And there's a lot of backlash. And so I ask people, okay, what is the right, like, type of distribution for you to use? What is the right type of distribution? Because that's the one that I like. So if you ask me what is the right type of distribution for pen testing, whatever you feel comfortable working with, right? Unless a client specifically tells you don't use that. Whatever it is that you feel comfortable working with and works for you or gives you the results that you want. Because, like, it just works well for me. But for example, my brother is just getting started with an InfoSec, and he told me something that made me think, testing, rather than going for Kali, I'm just going to switch the pen testing framework that I could use on DVM, because rather than downloading something or getting an extra, I'm the kind of person that try to add that capability to what I already have. Makes me think, I guess. Exploit Suggester. So Exploit Suggester is designed with the purpose of detecting security deficiencies for a given Linux kernel. It provides the following functionality. assessing kernel exposure on publicly known exploits. Tools assessing kernel on every publicly known Linux kernel exploit, and a very hardening security measures. So it can check for most security settings available in your Linux kernel, and it verifies not only the kernel compile time configurations, but also verifies runtime settings, giving a more complete picture of security posture. Here's the interesting part. Known Linux kernel exploit. So it has to be something that has already been, like documented. So if your exploit suggester is really not, like up to date, or it's not something that, like qualities or all the exploits documented and listed, then it might not be any good. Like I said before, do not rely just on third-party tools. You really have to have a good idea of what you're doing. We're going to take a quick look of how the output will look like. So this is my terminal right now. So this is the results that it's given. Much. What potential exploits you could use. But yeah, just most of the patched, like they take a lot of, they might be really resource consuming. A good countermeasure against them, it's also, know that if you're in security operations, there's just so much that you can do. But, like just keep your eyes open for compilation tools. You do not want to keep compilation tools on, like on an end user's computer. Gonna go unhacked, but I mean, if you're gonna get hacked, make it harder on them. Just don't offer everything on a silver platter. And then so I have 3 rules: never roll out a change without testing it, never test in production, and always follow rule 1 and 2. So that's something my boss always said. Well, just getting started, and basically it boils down to don't do anything stupid. SGID files. SGID is a Linux feature that gives low privilege users the ability to execute a file as the file owner. SGID stands for set user ID. Owned by the root user, and the setUID bit said no matter who executed the file, it's always going to run with root user privileges. Find how we would find setUID files. And this is the one that I found. I'm gonna run it through, like the manual way with the exploit, with the smart enumerator. Linux smart enumerator is also going to list it, right? So this is something to keep in mind. How to find a setUID. Normally, Linux permissions are broken into 3 different, like groups like this. So as users are represented by an S, as in the execute position. User, group, and other. User is pretty much like the owner. I love this meme. So 444. I know that they say that if you have to explain a meme, it's no longer funny, but going back into the permissions, we have a 4 user, we have a 4 for the group, and we have a 4 for the other. Always equals only read permissions, and this is a read and only area. So. Oh well, just nerdy humor. I'm not a nerd though. We look for an existing exploit and write an existing binary with a reverse shell. In this case, there is an exploit for it. So this is the one that I ran. It's called xim appropriate permissions. I ran it, and here it is. I am root. Easy Password is a plain text-based database that contains information for all user accounts on the system. It is owned by root and has 644 permissions by default. By root are users with suited privileges and readable by all system users. But only root can modify it. So what I did in here, if I wanted to exploit it, is what I did is created a hash in my local box. Why not? Because the format requires me to do so. A new line into the etc password file to create a new user. So this is what it looks like. I switched to my newly created user, and boom, I was root once again. Here with Linux, what you can do is put this double sign, it appends to the existing file. Appending just means you add it. And this is just going to basically write to it. As I was mentioning earlier, if a target is running a CMS system, it is recommended to look at the configuration files, as they can often contain sensitive information such as credentials. Not necessarily just credentials, but like I said, they can also be, for example, operating system versions or application versions, caches, usernames for other machines. Something very helpful. Cron jobs. A cron job is a Linux utility used for scheduling tasks that can be executed at a specific time. This type of tasks run with the security level of the user who owns them. The configuration for cron jobs is stored in the cron tab, which is known as cron tabs. So if we browse directly to the cron tab directory, this is where we're looking. This is what we want vicious. This is always going to be in Linux. These last couple of lines are what caught my eye. Try, okay, where is this file? If I'm supposed to write to it, I gotta know where it is. And I found it. So what I did in here is completely wipe this file blank. Okay, just, I don't want anything on it. So I rewrote, like the starts of shell, and this line, I am writing my shell. This is my, like local host. This is the computer where I wanted to connect back to. Wanted to use. Okay. And the reason why I'm doing cat override .sh is because I want to make sure that everything that I wrote is in there, so I can see it in here. And then this is my listener, and I can see that since this is a contact, determined amount of time, it started running and I got my root. Like reverse shell that you most commonly are going to use for them. Backups. Backups with permissions misconfigurations can contain sensitive information such as private keys. A private key is used to identify you to any server you're connecting to, so it must match the public key stored in the server's authorized keys for the account that you're trying to connect to. So you have to have a match to it, to your destination. Some common directories where backups should be found are temp, var, and root. This is what a private key would look like in a case like this. So We copy it and it's going to give us access. And here I'm just permissions. And trying to SSH to it, I'm giving the appropriate permissions in here of my victim host. I'm already root. So I'm just gonna try to show you guys this file. Looking into it, this is my private key. I wanted to give it any kind of, like random name, but I couldn't think of anything. So I was just like, yeah, see you. Boom, I'm root. So you want to be able to always look into your SSH folder, because if you have access to it, then it just means you have to do is to get the root key. Sources, privilege escalation cheat sheets. I know that this is just kind of tricky because it's recorded, but if y'all have any questions or anything that wasn't clear enough or anything that I could help you guys with, definitely reach out to me. I love memes. They're really funny. So yeah, again for joining me. And another thing I wanted to say to it's, like just thank you to the B-Sides group for making my presentation. I wanted to do this and I'm really excited. So yay. Awesome. Thanks.